Welcome to the third week of the Saddleback College Emeritus Institute Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lecture Series recorded in spring 2021. For information on the Saddleback Emeritus Institute, please visit www.saddleback.edu/emeritus. Professor Laura Hoffman is the guest lecture series moderator. She teaches art history and photography at the Saddleback College Emeritus Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Laura Hoffman, who will in turn introduce today's distinguished guest lecture series. Enjoy. I gotta stop. I gotta record. I messed it up.
Resuming, and I'm gonna mute.
Welcome to the third week of the Saddleback College Emeritus Institute Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lecture Series recorded in spring 2021. For information on the Emeritus Institute, please visit www.saddleback.edu/emeritus. Professor Laura Hoffman is the guest lecture series facilitator. She teaches art history and photography at the Saddleback College Emeritus Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Laura Hoffman, who will in turn introduce today's distinguished guest speakers. Enjoy.
Thank you, Karima. I appreciate that. So today, February 5th, 2021, Saddleback College Emeritus Institute is honored to welcome Ms. Meg Waters. She is a development director for the Voice of OC and works to develop multiple funding streams to support the news agency's continued growth. During her long career, she has earned the reputation as one of the top Orange County-based public relations and outreach strategists, having served many of the region's most prominent corporations, public agencies, and non-profit organizations. She has a deep commitment to open government, quality journalism, free speech, and civic involvement. Meg is best known for her work as a spokesperson for the 10 South County cities concerning the reuse of the former MCAS El Toro. Over the years, she has worked with nearly all of the cities in Orange County, the county auditor controller, and the transportation corridor agencies. In the private sector, she has represented several of the county's largest corporations. She also has considerable expertise working with nonprofits and education, including the Orangewood Children's Foundation, UCI, Concordia University, Santa Ana United School District, Catholic Charities, the Alzheimer's Association, and many others. Meg holds a bachelor's degree in comparative literature from UC Riverside. She has taught public relations at the community college level and is a frequent guest speaker. I have had the pleasure of working with Ms. Waters, and I'm honored to have her speak with us today. We welcome Meg Waters.
Hi, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you today. So I also want to welcome today, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Jean Pasco, who will be part of our forum today. Jean Pasco was a staff writer for the Times Orange County, covering the Board of Supervisors and county government, state and federal legislation pertaining to Orange County, and political campaigns for state legislative and congressional offices. As a staff writer for the Orange County Register, Ms. Pasco served as a reporter related to South County cities, transportation, general assignments, county government, and politics. Ms. Pasco held a variety of positions within Orange County, serving within the Office of the County Executive and the Orange County Clerk Recorder Department. You may remember Ms. Pasco from last year's speaker series, Can We Survive Politics 2020? What History Tells Us. So I want to thank both Meg Waters and Jean Pasco. And first, I am proud to present Meg Waters on the future of local journalism.
Thank you again, Laura. I'm really excited to be here. I thought I'd start with a little bit of background before we get into the future, and that's so that we're all starting on the same place. What is news? News is something that we didn't know before, or it's something unusual. I think the old adage is dog bites man, it's not news. Man bites dog is news. News has never been purely objective. Something that's objective is like a list, like your grocery list, the shopping list. You know, I want tomatoes and onions and peaches. That's objective. News tells a story. In the colonial times in the United States, before we were the United States, there were a lot of newspapers. They were all local. There weren't big national news outlets at that time. And those newspapers were mostly ads or things like almanacs, astrological projections, and so forth. And in between the ads were opinion pieces. Poor Richard's Almanac was basically Benjamin Franklin's opinion. The Federalist Papers, which are classics in American government literature, were actually opinions by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, done under a pseudonym in local New York State news publications. So that's how news basically started in the colonies. When we established a government, one of the very first things under Thomas Jefferson's direction was to institute the idea of a free press. His view was that in order for people to have a free government and to basically control their government, they needed to be informed. And that was the purpose of the press, is to inform the people so that they could control their government and vote knowing what was going on. When you looked at some of the news in the early days, you would not recognize it compared to what the news looks like now. Everything was opinion. And depending if you were a Tory, you probably thought the Federalist Papers were treasonous. If you were inclined towards independence, you probably thought they were great and agreed wholeheartedly with what they were saying. So when did the idea of objective news begin? It actually didn't really take place until the First World War. During the 1800s, news was directed. There were big empires made by news publishers, but in the early 1900s, as the U.S. was getting ready and considering whether they were going to participate in World War I, a fellow named Edward Bernays was hired by the U.S. government to build support for entry into World War I, which was at the time very controversial. Bernays worked with several of the newspapers in the country and encouraged articles to be promoted that made the case for U.S. involvement in Europe. As a result of this, there was a lot of controversy because many Americans didn't like the idea of the government paying someone to influence opinion, that opinion should be pure, so to speak. So as a result of that controversy, laws were passed. And now when you see someone doing public relations for government, they're called a public information officer because they weren't allowed to be called public relations specialists. So PR and news sort of grew up together. Over the 20th century, the idea of news being fair and balanced, objective, grew. And this was actually a new thing in the news world. Part of that was accomplished because there was only limited amount of space. When Walter Cronkite did the news, he had a half an hour, I think it was a half an hour, maybe it was an hour news program. And that limited the discussion that could be done on a national news program. The same with local newspapers. They only had as much space to discuss issues in the community as advertising supported. And the local newspaper was very general. It not only talked about what your city was doing, it talked about gardening, it talked about sports, it talked about business, it talked about all aspects of the community. And that gave a very limited amount of space, which means that there wasn't a lot of room for going off on tangents about what was going on. You pretty much just had to say, this is what's going on in the city hall. There was a special section reserved, clearly identified in the news, and sometimes in broadcast, identified as opinion. And that's where the publisher or the editor would offer their opinion on the news. A lot of the old time newspapers were called the, Main Street Democrat or the Second Street Republican, because that was indicating the opinion section of the newspaper was coming from a certain point of view. The Register was historically a libertarian publication. So it doesn't mean that their reporting was necessarily libertarian, but their opinion side was. And then they had what it was called an op-ed, which is where they would allow people from the community, usually more prominent people, to also express an opinion on the news that was going on in the day. So you really had three major sections in the news, all clearly defined between what was news, what are the facts of what's going on, and then what does leaders in the community think about the facts that are going on in the community. I would say that no human being can tell a story without putting something of themselves into it. It's just who we are as human beings. And in fact, telling a story without any kind of human observation would be extremely boring to read. I don't know when it was started, maybe Jean does, but there's a Society of Professional Journalists that it's kind of the umbrella association that most reporters belong to. And they have a code of ethics, and I'd really suggest that you take a look at it because it's what standards a real reporter will work under. It comes under 4 categories: seeking truth and reporting it, minimizing harm, and by that it means the public rights to know versus the harm to an individual. That may sound weird given what's going on in the news, but it really talks about if you're talking to someone who's a victim, you try not to victimize them again. If someone's a victim of rape or murder, or the family of murder victims, there is an effort on the part of the news to tell the story in a way that's not going to harm the victim. All bets are off when you're an elected official. The third aspect of the code of ethics is to act independently to avoid conflict of interest. Reporters won't take even lunch. You can't even pay for lunch with a reporter. And I mention that only because you have these quote unquote influencers now who are, they have blogs or websites and so forth, and they absolutely take product, payment, you name it, from the people that they're talking about. So that is a big distinction between news and what you see a lot on the web. And finally, reporters need to be accountable and transparent. If they make a mistake, it needs to be fixed quickly. They have to be, for example, you'll see on ABC, anytime there's a story around Disney, they always mention that Disney is their parent company. That's part of their transparency. So by the end of the 20th century, this objective news concept, even though it really can't happen, was part of the culture and part of the expectation. The difference now is the difference between news pages and opinion. If you remember diagramming sentences in school, those of you who are older will remember how to do that. You had a straight line that you started with, and you had the noun and the verb, the subject and the action, and sometimes the direct object, which was the what. So for example, see John run, plain sentence on the straight line. See John run downhill is the same thing, direct object. Where opinion creeps into a story is in the adjectives, the adverbs, and so forth, the parenthetical phrases that describe the action. And that can take a number of forms. In broadcast news, you have the added layer of body language. Somebody can roll their eyes, the tone of voice. All of that sends messages that are part of the story, but they can also be opinion. So for example, here's two sentences. The first one, in an effort to halt dependence on fossil fuels, President Biden revoked the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. The second sentence, killing thousands of jobs during a pandemic, President Biden revoked the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. Both sentences are true, but the opinion comes in and how the action is described. And if you're looking at the news, that would be the key thing that you would want to pay attention to in terms of evaluating the news, because there's a lot of true things that can be said about a certain topic. Both of them, there's nothing wrong with either one of those sentences. Both of them are true, but your point of view is going to influence on how accurate you perceive that information that's being given to you. Now you have to give context when you present the news as a reporter. If you just say, the president did this, that, and the other thing today, it's not going to be really helpful to the reader, because they want to know, why did this come up? Why did the president do this? What are the reasons surrounding it? And that's where people misunderstand sometimes the news and how it's being reported. So where's it all headed? In 1980, CNN gave birth to the 24-hour news cycle. In the 40 years that followed, dozens of lookalike stations bloomed. If the days of the publishing giants like Hearst and Pulitzer and Knight were the golden age of journalism, then cable news and the internet ushered in the golden age of nonsense. 24-hour news needs 24-hour content. It needs to engage audiences, and it needs to be profitable. News morphed from when, where, what, and why to pundits who don't tell the 4 W's, who, what, when, where, why. They tell you what they think the 4 W's are, what they think who, what, when, where, or why did. Opinion is shadowboxing the news today. Almost simultaneously, the internet was born. By the late 1990s, PCs and Apples became an affordable gateway to 24-hour news on demand. To fill the space, news morphed from the control of the newsmaker to the control of the pundit interpreting the newsmaker. And keep in mind, these pundits don't operate under the same code of ethics that journalists do. So going back to the do no harm, accountability, fixing your mistakes, telling the truth, all bets are off on pundits, and that includes websites and bloggers and all of that, and it's very confusing. At the start of the millennium, this confluence of limitless news on television and on the internet began the rapid death of the traditional newspaper. By the 2008 election, the Great Recession exposed the fact that printed news was already outdated by 24 hours before it hit the stand. The traditional newspaper, even though there's some of them left, they actually died 12 years ago. Advertisers realized that expensive print advertising, which supported large newsrooms with hundreds of reporters, was no longer possible, and it was no longer effective. So with many advertising and promotional options available to advertisers that were much less expensive than buying a full-page ad in the LA Times or the Orange County Register, newspapers became dinosaurs rather quickly. It was kind of like the comet hit the earth of the news industry and they all died overnight. So what happened? In 2009, the same year that Voice of OC started, an organization began called the Institute for Nonprofit News, which was the first big effort towards making news in an entirely different business model. You didn't have the publisher who owned the paper anymore. You had nonprofits formed that would provide particularly local news, because the decrease in advertising, while it hit the national news hard, it was devastating to local news. They just couldn't afford to produce the papers. Everything was moving to web-based. And for those of you that know how web-based advertising works, it's all on the clicks. So a story on the Santa Ana City Council has an extremely limited number of people who are going to click on that story compared to the Real Housewives of Orange County, which could have as much as an international audience. So interest in covering local civics dwindled because it wasn't profitable. Now, the people who do click on the Santa Ana City Council story are very interested in it, and that what happens in your local city council directly influences your life on a daily basis, much more, frankly, than what goes on in Washington on a daily basis. So local news, local politics was almost not being covered at all. So in 2009, the Institute started nonprofit news geared towards local news or topic-based news, like an environmental newspaper or something like that. Voice of OC was one of the very first members of this organization. Now, back when we started, nobody had heard of nonprofit news. In fact, a lot of people don't know about it. But it allowed the news organization to go for grant funding and individual donations. When Voice of OC started, our first major donor and grant was from the Orange County Employees Association and several other large donors. And for a number of years, as the newsroom was getting started, that was the funding. And there was a little bit of online donation. But over the years, through the association, the funding for nonprofit news has gotten more sophisticated. Many local news now have support from their community foundations. people are learning that if they want to know what's going on, they have to have a local newspaper. This became very evident this past year with COVID. We have 3 full-time reporters, and during the epidemic, you were getting full coverage of Eric Garcetti, mayor of Los Angeles' news conferences for an hour. The Register was doing hundreds and hundreds of stories, but almost all of them were regional or national wire stories. Nothing talking about Orange County, where you could get resources, where you could apply for unemployment, what was closed and what was open, what were the rules from the county health official. Whatever Mayor Garcetti was saying to the Los Angeles audience was completely irrelevant to Orange County. So the other problem was a lot of people can't afford the paywall at the Register. And so Voice of OC being free to anyone was an opportunity for people, no matter what their income level was, to find out exactly what was going on in Orange County. And we were publishing multiple stories a day on, as the crisis was expanding, so that people could actually get a sense of what was going on. That in turn, for not just Voice of OC, but for all of our colleagues in the Institute for Nonprofit News, really expanded our coverage and showed people how important local news was in order to follow their community and to make a difference. You've heard the phrase, think globally, act locally. Well, you can't act locally if you don't know what's going on locally. So Voice of OC, like many other publications across the country, have been trying to bring that local news back so that people could get involved with their community. Our focus is to write not for the business community and not for the power brokers in the county, but our news is designed to reach the grassroots, the people, the average person who all of a sudden decides that they want to get involved on an issue. There's potholes on the street. We had a great lady, Rose Tingle, who was concerned about the county's animal shelter that was built before World War II, and she felt that animals were being mistreated and it was not adequate. She went to the Board of Supervisors to complain. They kind of shoved her off. Noberto, our publisher, met with her afterwards, told her how to write an opinion piece. She wrote 2 opinion pieces a month for over a year, generated 5 grand jury investigations, and ultimately the Board of Supervisors built a $45 million animal shelter, and that was Rose's doing directly. So that's what people can do in their community when they get involved, but they can't get involved if they don't have the information to know what's going on and be an opportunity to make their voice heard. And what Voice is doing is we've got a very open opinion section, community opinion section, and that's what Rose used. We will publish anybody's opinion. We're not limited by newsprint. We're not limited by broadcast. So if you've got an opinion that's not slanderous and it's cogent, of about 800 words, we'll run out an opinion. And many people have used that as kind of the town square to voice their opinion on public policy issues, on things that should be done, shouldn't be done, whatever. So that's the role that we are trying to play in the community, is to bring civics to the people. 2 years ago, we started in the fall of 2018, 3 years ago. The Register basically let go the entire arts and culture staff. This is the people who are covering symphony, art, performance art, written novels, all that kind of thing. And so they came, Paul Hodges, who's the editor, came to us and said, would we take on arts and culture? And at first we thought, how does that mix with civics? But then we thought, every revolution has a theme song and a logo. So I could see arts and culture going hand in hand with civics, because if civics represents the thinking of people in an area, art and culture represents the soul. So the two of them can blend together, and we're working on how to make that work together even better. But it's new. It's kind of a new aspect to Voice of OC that I'm really excited about. I think it's going to grow and do very well. So at this point, I would open it up to the audience, but I don't think we can do that here. So I'm going to have Jean weigh in.
Oh, and I'm very happy to do so, Meg. We go back a long way through several wars. I mean, so much of what you said really resonates with me, because I started in local news really, way back in '81 in Arizona, and then I was at the Register in 1983. And you kind of, as a reporter, you go through, you cover local news, and then you kind of move out of it onto a larger stage. But being retired now, I am a voracious consumer of local news. I travel a lot, but I still want to know what goes on in my community. And so I am looking for those local news sources, and have really found Voice of OC to be just essential in being able to keep tabs on things. It used to be that the catchphrase was all the news that's fit to print. And we used to joke in the newsroom, it's actually all the news that fits, because you're limited by how many ads you sell, and how many pages you can have, and that sort of thing. And with digital, you don't have that issue. And particularly in a nonprofit newsroom, it's really kind of all the news gathering you can afford is what becomes the the only kind of register on it. So to me, it's really an exciting way to see journalism continue, because what I've watched over the years is journalism, true journalism of providing people information, is just whittling away, because people are more interested in opinion. It just, it riles people up. And when you pick up a paper and you browse, you get exposed to so many things. But if you're just seeking out one online source or another, that's all you're looking at. So particularly with the COVID pandemic, it's been really important to find sources where you can get unfiltered and good information about what's happening, as far as the number of cases, hospitalizations, and all that. It's interesting that local news has kind of had a bit of a rebound because of the pandemic, because this is something that hits very close to home. You want to know what's going on in my neighborhood, what's going on. Is there a rash of cases, and I'm going to go to my local grocery store and maybe have to take extra precautions, that sort of thing. I'm going to review some notes here, but the Pew Research Center, which does wonderful things on people responding to information, not just news, but all kinds of different information, really seen a bit of a resurgence with the importance of local news, in that people are spending, actually, they say, more time accessing local, state and local news on COVID than they are on national news. Now, most people are looking at both, but more people, 23%, are looking at state and local sources, 15% are looking at national sources. So it's really an indication that when it comes to something that has an immediate effect, locally, people are looking to those local sources of news. The other thing I was thinking about, when I was at the LA Times, the height of when I was a reporter there, they had 1.2 million subscribers. I mean, that is a lot. That's a huge news juggernaut, right? The most recent numbers that we've seen are now they're down to about 225,000 print subscribers. I mean, that's a 66% drop just over the last 10 years. So when you talk about the newspapers, hitting the meteor, that's kind of, that's an apt analogy for sure. Now the Times has also picked up about 270,000 digital subscribers, but this is something where you talk about paywalls, and people got so used to, in the digital revolution, getting information for free. They would just pop online and find information. And then, I think the Wall Street Journal was the only publication that paywalled anything, for any length of time. Well, then when paywalls started being added, because newspapers realized, we're just not bringing in the revenue. It's like 1/10 of the revenue that you'd get from print. Then they started putting these paywalls up. And so a lot of people kind of fled those, being subscribers, because they didn't want to, they were not used to paying that much money. And with so many options out there, they didn't want to keep paying it, which is again why something like Voice of OC is really, to me, seems like the next logical progression for where people can get news. And again, it's kind of focused locally, because that's where the biggest impact is.
During the COVID last year, up until last year, we had somewhere in the 300,000 to 500,000 unique viewers per month looking at Voice of OC. And we had done a study of who these people were, and we found that most of our readers were people who either worked for government, sold to government contractors, or people who were involved in the community. So it was every community's, person that haunted City Hall. During last year, we had as many as 3.5 million unique viewers in a month. Our highest was during the election, when we had 2 wildfires, and probably one of the most controversial elections in anybody's memory. And we had November, I think it was 3.5 million people that came to our site. Now, not all of those were Orange County residents. That's more than people live here, but it was people from all over the country. But now our readership has gone to about 750 a month on average. So we're right up there in terms of the impact, right up there, I would say even more so than the Register and the Times in many respects. And the keeping it free means that we have, a big effort to donations. We have thousands of individual donors who either donate every month or donate on a one-time basis. We've expanded our grant funding, and we've been encouraging more major donors. That's really the important thing, is when you have big donors that you can count on year after year to sustain it, so that we can make decisions about reporting. Now, we do all this with literally 3 full-time reporters, plus Norberto, who's editor and publisher. We had Tracy Wood, who I think you know, Jane.
Yeah.
She was our editor, our civic editor, up until March of last year. She was one of the few women reporters that covered combat in Vietnam. She was a reporter's reporter. I mean, she trained our young people like nobody else. She could have edited any publication in the country. But unfortunately, she passed away in March of last year. So our publisher took on both roles. And we have recently added Vic Jolly, who I think you may know, as an editor. We have an active student program with Chapman University and Cal State Fullerton, where junior and senior journalism students actually get into the field and do some very local community-based reporting, and Vic kind of oversees that. So it's growing. We're experimenting a lot, which is really fun. I think to your point, Jean, about people gravitating to opinion, I think my sense, and this is my personal opinion, people have gotten to the point where this whole opinion, fake news thing has really focused them on the public, on wanting to know, can you just tell me what happened? and lose the spin. And I think that's healthy. And I think that you're going to see more news outlets try to get back to some of that. Let's just tell people what's going on and be clear about where the opinion is, so that they know when they're hearing something. A lot of people in the public, I mean, my whole career in PR was very hard to educate clients on the difference between opinion and news, because they'd see something in the opinion pages in the register and freak out. How can you print that? That's not, no. It's like, that's his opinion. He gets to put his opinion in there. You can write your own opinion if you want to. And I think people just forget sometimes when you look at like a Fox News or CNN, most of what you see on that is opinion. But I have to say, when you get to the local level of Fox News, CNN doesn't have a local news agency, but the local broadcast CNN is as fair as any of the other networks. It's not that you can cover a fire and there's not a whole lot of spin you can put on it. Houses are burning down. That's the fact. So I think, again, local news is much more trustworthy. I think as it grows and as communities begin to embrace and understand the importance of local nonprofit news, you're going to see a lot more community support, financial support, which means that you can add more reporters and more topics and so forth.
Absolutely. And to your point about, kind of talking about all these talking heads, as you said, this really was an outgrowth of the 24/7 news cycle that became available on cable news. To just have an anchor reading in front, the script in front of them, you couldn't do it 24/7. And so it's like, wow, we can't repeat this news 50 times a day. People will leave us. So what can we do that's interactive and engaging? Well, we can have people talking about the news and giving their opinion. And that's really what gave rise to it. But what we've seen is that that's become so popular that that's all you end up with a lot of times. It's very frustrating trying to go online, like, okay, who's just reporting the news and not talking about their opinion about the news? And it becomes very limiting to get that sort of information. Now, when you talk about the Voice of OC newsroom and you've got 3 reporters, oh my gosh, when I was at the Register, we had, I think, 50 reporters. And when I was at the Times, there were just, probably a couple hundred over the whole breadth of the newsroom. And because the advertising revenue coming in could support that kind of robust reporting. Now it's, I'm not sure how many folks are still there. It's kind of heartening. A lot of changes are going on at the LA Times, and folks that grew up in the Orange County newsroom are finding themselves in positions of being in the leadership at the LA Times. I think that's wonderful, because I think Orange County is a great news place. It was a great news place to grow up in the newsroom in. But how do you approach, Meg, getting more revenue so that you can not have 3 reporters, but get 30? How are you guys, do you have like a strategic plan for trying to bring more money in? Because again, the advertising revenue and the ads physically in the paper aren't a limiter, but clearly pay for journalism is.
Well, it's funny because I have 3 years experience in revenue raising for journalism, and that's probably only 2 years less than the most experienced person, because journalism, newspapers used to have big foundations. They used to be a major donor to philanthropy in a given community. And so, like even in Orange County Community Foundation, if you go do a search there, you're not going to see a category for journalism. So a lot of work has to be done just to convince the philanthropy world that journalism ought to be a line item, because it without good journalism, every other charity that you're supporting has no way of being known to the community. So our game plan, as I had mentioned, is individual donations, major donors, and grants. We don't do sponsors. Some nonprofit news do advertising. We have shied away from that because we get a lot of grief that we're being paid for by our grant funders, which have never, ever told us how to do a story. And in fact, OCEA, which is still a grant funder for us, but not as at the level they used to be, they get angry with some of our stories too. So the trick in philanthropy, and I've never found an answer for this, is how do you raise money from people that sometimes may not like your like what you produce? If you're doing the story right, I used to always tell my clients, you're a little annoyed with some of it and you like some of it. And so we're going out and asking people to donate money to a news organization that's going to bring you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. And that's particularly problematic with corporations. We found that for a large number of them, when we talk about sponsorships or advertising, it was like, okay, but then I want you to cover this project from a nice point of view, from a we'll approve the stories about our project. And no, that's not how it works. So it does limit us. Other newsrooms do what they call advertorial, where a business could buy a certain amount of space and do a nice story about their project or their product. We've decided not to do that because we think it's confusing enough out there than trying to do advertorial. So we're sticking, for the time being, I mean, this can change. It's a very new industry and things are changing all the time, but online donors, major donors, and foundations are pretty much the bedrock of where we're going from. Gives us the most independence.
How much, Meg, and then I'll turn it back over to Laura so I don't dominate all the questions, but how much of your viewership is coming in through, and your viewership, I mean readership because you're reading, how much is coming in from PCs or Macs or whatnot, desktops versus mobile? Because I've found that a lot of journalism, particularly newspaper sites, they're clunky. I don't like the presentation, and I wonder, I know it's probably an overwhelming amount coming in on a mobile application, and it's tricky to get that to work right.
Yeah, we've our digital editor could give you more accurate numbers. I'm not up to the minute on it, but I know the majority of people who view our website view it from some kind of a mobile device. I had mentioned to Sonia Quick, our digital editor, about doing an app a while ago, and she was like, apps are bad. We've optimized our web page to make it work on a mobile device, because as you said, apps can be just really quirky. Stay tuned, in a couple of weeks, we're coming out with a retooled website that should make the user experience even better. Last year, we were fortunate enough to be accepted into the Facebook Accelerator program, which included a $100,000 grant. And that was game changer for us in terms of helping us learn how to market ourselves online, and gave us the revenue to improve our website. When we were getting these big stories, we almost crashed every time because our server wasn't big enough to handle the influx. So now we've got that fixed, and we'll have a whole new, it won't look too much different, but the back end, it's going to still look like the car it was, but the engine's going to be really souped up.
You know, I don't want to get into a whole discussion about Facebook and Twitter and who they've kicked off and, you know, who can be on, but there's obviously everybody's watching. There's a lot of chaos going on out there in the newsosphere about, you know, what's opinion, what's not, who's able to get on these platforms, whether, you know, Parler got kicked off their Amazon Global. So can you talk a little bit about, does Voice of OC have like community standards for if I want to put in an editorial and you know, go after somebody? What sort of standards are you looking at? And, you know, this question of, there's a lot of citizen journalism or journalists out there, and really it's a lot of folks just getting angry and spewing opinion, but how does Voice of OC kind of weigh that?
Well, that's a moving target also. We used to have a place underneath the stories where people could rant and rave. And it got to the point where there was like a handful of just wackos, none of whom use their own name. And they were it just was like not furthering the discussion. So we ended that. We decided, you know, Facebook and Twitter is designed for people to talk. So we pretty much let them say what they're going to say on Facebook or Twitter. And we don't, although it's hard for me sometimes to not jump in, we don't jump in, we kind of let them do their thing. In terms of our community opinion page, we do have guidelines on the website. And basically we want people, if we really want to encourage both sides of the aisle, so to speak, to talk. We love it when we have a big issue and one side put something out and then the other side put something out. And it gives people, even though both are opinion, it's so much easier to pick out what you think when you see both opinions side by side, as opposed to weeks apart. So we encourage that. We read them over for something that's slanderous or blatantly false. But we've gone to court to defend people. There was a story in the last election cycle by the head of the Republican Party, talking about an individual who had some background issues. And we ended up going to court to defend his opinion. So I don't know how much about that I can talk. I don't want to get myself in the same predicament. But the idea is we want to make it as open as it can be without completely going off the rails. And that sometimes is a judgment call. But Teresa Sears, who is a longtime community activist, kind of manages that page. And Roberto, the publisher, reads those before they go live. So it's a very popular part of Voice of OC. People like to read those. And I would love, you know, the more the merrier. The only caveat I'd say, if you've got something that you want to pontificate on that has a time sensitivity, like a vote is coming up or something, put a big note on the top of it so that our editor knows that this is about, you don't want it to run 3 weeks after the vote was taken. But other than that, we look forward to having people's opinion. Any other?
Yes, well, thank you. This is a wonderful exchange. I really appreciate it. I have a few questions which came in from students, and I have one of my own. And I'm going to pose my question to either Meg Waters or Jean Pasco. And this was a great question, I thought, from a student. Do reporters, and this would be television and radio broadcasters, do they have a code of ethics like journalists? And this is the realization that some writers and journalists are reporters, but not all reporters are journalists.
Well, that kind of is a tough one because the lines have blurred. And like Meg was saying, back in the very beginning, you had you had pamphleteers standing up on a street corner and they were promoting a point of view. So their reporting was the way they saw the facts. And so we went away from that after the First World War into World War II. And since then, and we're kind of getting back to that again with standing on the virtual street corner and giving your opinion. So what I always have looked for, being a former journalist, is things that are labeled analysis or opinion, because then that helps me as the reader know, okay, I'm getting a point of view here, I'm getting a spin, and that's okay because I know the spin is there. What I don't like as a reader is if I'm reading something that is not labeled as opinion, and it's clearly opinion, like the two examples Meg gave of talking about President Biden, discontinuing the Keystone Pipeline. You can talk about that in very different ways, depending on what your spin is, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. So really, anybody that's presenting news to me should have their own code of ethics. But I will tell you that this is a very hotly debated issue among journalists. I'm still on a lot of journalist Facebook groups and other things where there are a lot of younger journalists that believe that you owe it to the reader to call BS on something. You owe it to the reader to be skeptical and to not just accept what's given to you, not just be a scribe, but to really call somebody out as, this is untruthful, etc. Back in the day when I was reporting and we'd cover political campaigns, you'd see a lot of spin from different sides, and that's what you want to do, because candidate A wants to spin what candidate B did and vice versa. So we would go out and we would do kind of fact checks on mail and on cable ads and that sort of thing. You still see that, the fact checks that come out, but there is a lot more tolerance, if you will, among journalists now for spinning in just a straight news story. So really, it's almost consumer beware. And that's why I think people have sought out different news sources, because they know they're either going to get the spin they want or there's no spin, and that's what they prefer. I mean, some folks would rather watch NPR or watch, not watch it, but listen to NPR and watch PBS, because they feel like there's going to be less, analysis that's put in the mix.
And Meg, go ahead.
I think I mentioned the Society for Professional Journalists does have that code of ethics that I think everybody should take a look at. And I would imagine broadcast reporters follow the same code. They're all journalists. I think where you run into the problem is the opinion people who are all over the map. The way a story can play out, if you've got a politician who's saying, the moon is made of blue cheese, we don't necessarily say he's lying, but we say, well, according to recent studies from astronauts who visited the moon, they found the moon is made of rocks. And so you're not calling them a liar necessarily, but you're just using the data and kind of letting the reader decide whether they think the guy is lying or not. I think that's the simplest way to explain it.
Yeah, you said, Meg, that the people writing stories are human. You're getting, it's not just a list of facts. You're getting the stringing together. So the thing the reader would be aware of would be how the sentences are formed, the adjectives used, and we can kind of critically think when we're getting a spin job. There was a follow-up question. It was actually in the same discussion. As a viewer, some of my students get very disappointed when they find out that some of their favorite reporters over-exaggerated and misled the audience.
Right, I'm going to jump in on that because that is something that we're seeing play out in real time. Now, I obviously, I don't want to spin on this, but you've got I think a $1.3 billion lawsuit by Dominion Voting Systems against Fox. You've seen just in the last day or so, Smartmatic file a $2.7 billion lawsuit against Fox and others, Rudy Giuliani and some of the folks involved in the allegations about voter fraud in the election. And these two companies are involved in software and in the actual making voting systems, and they've actually filed suits claiming harm from things that were said not only by opinion reporters but also by just regular folks just reading the news. So this to me is going to be very interesting to follow, because where does freedom of speech, how does that cross the line? You know, you have freedom to give your own opinion, but you don't have the freedom to libel or slander somebody. And so there are very different levels to determine when that happens based on whether you're a public figure or not. But, you know, right now we're seeing several freedom of speech lawsuits out there where companies have alleged that they have been harmed by these opinions and by untruths that they see that harm their reputation. So there's several lawsuits out there, and you know, this is kind of the Wild West in a way with online journalism, because really anybody can have a mouthpiece. A lot of bloggers years ago got into trouble for things because they were affiliated with publications, and then the publications said, oh no, you can't say that. You don't have freedom of opinion now, working for me, kind of thing. So we're waiting to see how all this shakes out.
One of the things that we've never faced before is, in the old days, the newspaper publishers bought paper and published what they want. If you were going to sue them, you didn't sue the paper mill. You sued the publisher who created it. The same thing with broadcasts, pretty much owned whatever channels that they had, and they put the stuff out, so they had to stand by it. Now you have this intermediary, which is the social media, that is sort of the paper mill, and they let everybody print on it whatever they want. And so it's hard to determine who has to be accountable for what's on. It's almost like they're going back and suing the paper mill. You can't do that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all gets sorted out in the courts. I think it's going to be a long time working that out. My personal view is I like to skew to the side of free speech. I think it's dangerous when we start telling who can say what. But the corollary to that is the public, if you really want to live in a free society, you're going to have to smarten up and learn how to pick as my former business partner said, pick the fly poop out of the pepper, and it's hard. But you're going to have to be a more critical reader and consumer of news, and not just, you know, a vacuum that sucks it all up, because it's going to make you crazy too. You've got to be able to find sources that you trust, and that's hard right now. It'll work its way out, but it's going to be challenging.
Very good. Any other questions? I have just one more. I know a few other people joining us may have questions. I know I have one more. This is a question either of you could answer. When it comes to news, how does something get to be a story which gains our ears, gains the news time, while other topics get buried, never see the light of day? And how could that slant opinion?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jean has been in the newsroom longer, so I'll just give a quick answer. But yes, that's exactly it, how you pick stories. In our case, we pick stories that are more to the grassroots. You know, what do people want to know that are in the, that aren't necessarily business leaders? It's not that business leaders don't need to know this information, but we tend to go to the grassroots in terms of the kind of information that we present. But I'm going to let Jean talk about what goes on inside how the sausage is made in the newsroom.
Well, the old adage used to be that it was the job of reporters to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And, you know, the thought was that it's news. If somebody is getting beaten down and they are getting taken advantage of, something is not, it's not right. It's not in the public interest. That's, you know, automatically news. When I was in newsrooms, a lot of it was people coming to me for here's a story and I think it's important, and I'd go, you know, check it out. And so 90% of the stories were generated from outside, and they bring it to reporters. And that's what I'm really worried about, because where do you go now if you are being if you're in a horrible situation and somebody is taking advantage of you, or taking advantage of a situation, your neighborhood is has some dangerous situation. It used to be you'd go to your newspaper or you go to your, you know, your local TV reporter, and, you know, eye on your side kind of programs, and reporters would go out and they'd expose things, and that the venues for that are really, they've dried up a lot, I think. Just as a final thought, as someone that worked in the archives for a long time, so much of our community story, our Orange County story, was told through newspapers. That's how we found out about things, because that was the institution with longevity, and literally because newsprint stuck around a long time if you protected it. Now we have this ephemeral digital world, and there are attempts to keep newspapers and to, you know, save screenshots of things. And I guess one final question for Meg is, how is Voice of OC archiving so that 100 years from now, when we want to see the story of Orange County as we've gone through this pandemic, for example, how are we going to get access to that?
Well, we do have archives, and we're actually in this whole new upgrade. We're working on some of that too. To be honest with you, I don't know. We hope we're going to be here in 100 years and still managing our own archives. I would imagine that if Voice of OC went away, we've got every story we've ever done, just like any newspaper would have. And you can sort through it in our archive section right now. How that would be, you're asking me to speculate on technology that I can't even imagine would exist. So I think it would be too valuable to just lose it, to just throw it away. Unless something weird happens and all technology dies, but we'd have bigger problems than than Voice of OC's archives if that happened. But yeah, it's probably the most tangible asset long-term that a news organization has is their archives. So I would imagine somebody, especially as a nonprofit, because it's not just Norberto, it's the whole board of directors and everybody else that would have to steward the archives, which is the asset of the publication. We don't have a building, we don't have trucks, we don't have all of that kind of stuff. So that's our asset.
Well, wonderful. So if anybody wants more information about the Voice of OC, I have added it to Canvas. And Meg, if you wanted to put in a final, maybe a final statement about how we can access your outlet in an efficient way. I think you have expanded the technology. And also you can find out how to weigh in on the opinion section under certain guidelines. And then we're
voiceofoc.org. You can subscribe for free. There's a little subscribe button, and just hit that and give us your email address, and you can choose what kind of stories you want, or you want all of them. There's no charge for that at all. There's no paywall. If you want to write an opinion, you can go to our community opinion page. And if you scroll through that, you'll see our guidelines, and just take a look at those. And it gives you the email address of where you send it to. You could also call. There's a phone number to call if you have some questions and so forth. It's pretty easy. It's all online. Hopefully it's user-friendly. We try very hard to make it user-friendly. So, and if you're so inclined, hit the donate button too, because it won't be here without the community contributing to it. And if you can make a larger donation, I'd love to get a phone call. My phone number's on there too, and email.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank both of you, Meg Waters and Jean Pasco. Thank you for today. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot, and I'm wishing for balanced news, and thank you for being a part of that discussion.
Thank you, Laura. It was great. And Jean, it was all great to see you too. Both of you.
Thank you.
Two of my favorite ladies. We've both been through wars together.
Yes. All right. Thank you again.